Well, hello, everybody. Today we're going to take a detour into the classical realm and explore Chopin's Preludes. If you've ever heard them, you're probably struck by the stark difference between the feeling in the major and the minor preludes. With Chopin's Preludes, I'm going to show you how major and minor are concepts that go far beyond a simple difference in scales. In other words, rather than being inherent feelings, major and minor are really what we make of them. We've all heard before that major pieces feel happy, cheerful, bright, or calm, but minor pieces feel sad, dark, somber, or perhaps dramatic. But the thing is that a minor scale is only a major scale with a flat 3, flat 6, and flat 7. So why do these changes make it feel so sad? Well, it could be that minor thirds, sixths, or sevenths relative to the root are naturally less pleasing than major thirds, sixths, or sevenths, just due to the physical properties of the sound waves. What I think is a lot more likely is that these are cultural constructs, because there are other scales in different cultures that have a happy connotation, even though they have striking similarities to the Western minor scale. And of course, these ideas of major being happy and minor being sad are definitely going to influence us when we make compositions. And so therefore, major being happy, minor being sad are just self-fulfilling prophecies. I do need to step aside and mention how we create dissonance, and the importance of this will soon become clear. The most dissonant intervals are minor seconds and tritones, also known as diminished fifths or augmented fourths. And from that, we can find some common dissonant chords: the diminished, the half diminished, the augmented, and the minor sixths. A lot of these contain tritones, which I've shown in the red carets. However, this chord, augmented, doesn't have any of those dissonant intervals. In fact, it's just made out of thirds, even though there are no dissonant intervals between any given pairs of notes in this chord. The three notes together sound strange. All right, let's return to the preludes. Obviously, we can sort them by being major or minor, but I also sort them by whether they're fast or slow. So we're going to start our conversation with the minor fast preludes. First up is number 8 in F sharp minor. This piece has extremely fast and frantic playing. There's a rapid harmonic rhythm with a lot of odd chord changes and dissonant harmonization. Furthermore, the phrases tend to slow down towards the end, which makes the start of each new phrase sound very rushed. So let's talk about some specific passages. What I want you to notice first is that the left hand plays a triplet of 16th notes, which is the span of a single eighth note, while the right hand is playing 4 32nd notes. And this creates a 4 against 3 polyrhythm, which probably sounds chaotic and maybe a little bit strange to our ears. I also want you to notice the dissonant chords that are down here: A minor 6, G diminished. There's also successive dominant seventh chords that don't really resolve to their respective tonics. And I also finally want to point out that there are some notes in the right hand that harmonize strangely with the chords. They might create a tritone with the root, or maybe they'll create a minor second with the root. In this next passage, once again, we have some weird chords and we have some notes that harmonize strangely with them. But I also want you to pay attention to the melody that I've shown in blue. There's a lot of minor seconds in sequence in this melody, and that also adds to the dissonance of this passage. So that brings us to number 10 in C sharp minor. This piece has extremely fast and frantic playing, like the previous one. There's lots of low notes in the left hand, but also high runs in the right hand to contrast that. And it can also be a little bit dissonant at times. FYI, I'm not going to talk about specific passages for every piece, or else we'd be here forever. But I do think that each piece has its own beauty, and hopefully some of these pieces that got less airplay will get some more airplay in the bonus episode. In that case, onward to the next prelude. Number 12 in G sharp minor feels like running. It has very dramatic dynamics and the pacing of an angry person. It features a driving beat with really low, forceful left hand hits. Of course, it has dissonant harmonization and melody, and it ends in something that I like to call a slamming door ending, and I will discuss what that means in a bit. First, let's look at this passage. I really want to highlight the dissonant melody here, which is ascending in minor seconds. And this is going to not only be dissonant in and of itself, but it's going to combine weirdly with the other notes. So for example, here we have a augmented fourth in sequence. Here we have a B augmented, another augmented fourth in sequence, and then a tritone in harmony. In this passage, I really want to highlight the dramatic modulations. Right now we see C, B, and E minor, so we must be in the key of E minor. But when we get down to this B7 here, we expect to resolve back to the tonic, which is E minor at the moment, but it goes to D sharp minor instead, which is a really unexpected and strange move. On top of that, the D sharp minor becomes a D sharp 7, and that resolves naturally to the home key of G minor. But I also want to highlight some dissonant moments in the left hand. In this chord, there's a C and an F sharp, and this has E sharp, B, and C double sharp. And the notation's a little bit weird, but if you look at what those notes actually represent, it's just a B diminished. And finally, I want you to notice that there's a ton of minor seconds in this melody. All right, now let's look at that slamming door ending. I've boxed it in red here. And a slamming door ending, first of all, carries the sentiment of an angry person slamming a door. It occurs during dominant to tonic movement in the minor key. And critically, it has loud, forceful notes. Oftentimes, this is just the roots. That brings us to number 14 in E flat minor. This piece feels like a storm with just a tiny bit of reprieve at the end. Imagine a kid who's discovered a piano for the first time and is just putting their hands anywhere on the piano. This piece sounds just a little bit more ordered than that. As a result, the sequence is incredibly dissonant, and there's also an emphasis on low notes, which are played very loudly in this piece. Now let's discuss number 16 in B flat minor. This piece opens with really loud chords and low voicing, which will certainly startle you if you're not expecting it. This is also a good time to mention that when we group a lot of notes close together in range in a lower register, they tend to sound really muddy, and that contributes to the unsettled feeling in this piece. It also features frantic fast playing, so much so that it's hard to make out the individual notes. There's a full use of the piano range because there's very low and loud left hand parts, but also very high right hand melodies. Of course, there are fast and dissonant chord changes, and it also has a slamming door ending. So in this passage, I'm only showing the left hand because it allows us to see what the chords are. We see some dissonant diminished chords here, but let's go a little bit deeper than that. Pay attention to this E flat diminished. It has a tritone between E flat and A. And F7 also has that same tritone. And furthermore, they both are going to B flat minor normally. So they're functionally equivalent, but Chopin opted for the more dissonant choice of chord. For F diminished to C minor, this is actually the exact same pattern, but just a whole step up. Then we throw in a lot of weird diminished chords, and there's chromatic dissension in the bass line. And then we're thrown back into the home key. Now look here at these crazy runs featuring minor seconds. I first want to bring our attention to the first measure, where there's chromatic dissension in the top note. And that's going to make the beginning feel really tense. But I also want you to notice that this chord is an F7, and with a G flat on top in the beginning, which is a minor second above, that adds to the tension created in this first measure. I also want you to pay attention to the other examples of these chromatic runs, because it's doubled in octaves in the left hand. And this has the effect of making it sound more dramatic because it draws your attention to these phrases a lot more. Okay, number 18 in F minor. This piece has a very dissonant intro, and it has frantic, fast playing, often spastic playing as well. And this is often in octaves, as I had said previously. This creates a dramatic effect. Again, there's emphasized low notes, and it also has a slamming door ending. So let's look at that intro. There's a very ominous melody here with a bunch of minor seconds, and furthermore, it gets interrupted by this chord on the left hand, which is a D diminished over C, which, again, those low chords and low voicings are going to sound really muddy. And furthermore, the lowest notes are C and D flat, which are already dissonant when they're sounding together. It's not even clear that F minor is the home key at this point, so everything sounds kind of dissonant, and we're left ungrounded because we don't have a home key yet. Now, this phrase is kind of cool because this phrase repeats itself down here, and there's a whole elaboration to that phrase tacked onto the end. What's more is that there's a doubling of the phrase in octaves here as well. And let's not forget about all those minor seconds in sequence and those tritones in sequence. Now, here's a fun example of one of those really crazy runs. 17 notes into the space of just half a measure, which is extremely fast. Furthermore, the chord that sounded before it is an F diminished, which is a dissonant chord. And the run mostly seems to spell out that chord. Of course, there's a couple of minor second movements that are also thrown in there as well. That brings us to number 22 in G minor. This piece starts out with ominous left-hand playing, with the initial interval being a minor second. There's pounding low notes and pounding high notes. And it is a fast prelude, although not as fast as some of the other ones that I just showed you. And it too has the slamming door ending. And now for the final and my favorite minor fast prelude, number 24 in D minor. This piece features frantic fast playing and a very active loud and low left-hand part. There's runs that are making full use of the upper piano range, and dissonance, of course, is spread throughout. As we get closer to the end, melodies are also played in octaves, which is increasing the drama before the end of the piece, where it concludes by pounding the lowest D on the piano 3 times. So I first want to talk about the left-hand part. So left-hand part obviously is moving very fast. You can see the 16th notes, but there's also big leaps in tonal range. So it's temporally and tonally very active. And this kind of pattern repeats itself throughout the entire piece. Now look at this run. It is 28 notes squeezed into the space of just a few eighth notes. Finally, in this slide, let's look at the very end of the piece. There's this run here. I should mention that the 8 here means that all the notes under the dotted line are played an octave higher than they're written. So this is starting out really, really high and ending very low. This run encompasses most of the range of the piano, and we're ending on hitting that D again very hard multiple times. In fact, the strings are pounded so hard that you can kind of hear a metallic ringing sound. And here's a fun example of dissonance in this piece. In measure 41 and 42, the left hand starts spelling out D flat major. And then in measure 43, a diatonic phrase in that key begins. But then we come here and we repeat that phrase, but it ends in A instead of A flat, which is really jarring because, and to keep D flat major, we expect A flat. But furthermore, the left hand is also playing an A instead of an A flat, and this spells out a D flat augmented. I feel like dynamics also play a role in making this passage very dramatic, because notice the piano dynamics right here. It gets really quiet at this moment, almost as if to say, I'm going to do something weird, which is playing this A. So I'm going to do it quietly so that people don't notice. But then as the passage goes on, we notice how the dynamics build to forte again. We have these patterns in octaves, and right after that, it dumps us back into the main theme of the piece. So here's a mood board for the minor fast preludes. What did we learn? Well, they feel chaotic, angry, dramatic, maybe even nervous. They feature frantic fast and sometimes spastic playing. They are dissonant, so they use minor seconds and tritones, odd chords, odd harmonies, and unpredictable and strange chord changes. They're also loud and have very dramatic dynamics. They use tonal range that really highlights the whole range of the piano. We have both aggressive low left-hand parts and very frantic high right-hand parts. And of course, some of them have a slamming door ending. The point that I really want to drive home here is that these elements I've shared with you, which all give these pieces their characteristic feeling, has nothing to do with the fact that the scale is minor. Now, I can anticipate some people might be saying, well, couldn't the idea of tritones and minor seconds being dissonant also be a cultural construct? And even if that is true, the point is Chopin is using those elements to create certain feelings, and he's doing so independently of the scale being minor. By contrast, we're going to see a deliberate effort to make the major fast preludes feel pleasing and joyful. So up first is number 1 in C major. This piece feels like flying and has a generally bright demeanor. It's very consonant and has lots of tempo variation, which helps to make the piece feel more playful. It also ends very calmly and quietly. That brings us to number 3 in G major. This piece is very fast, and some might say it feels a bit frantic, but I think it feels bright, jumpy, and playful. This one also ends very calmly despite being very fast. So let's look at an example of the consonants of this piece. There's lots of alternation between A7 and D, which means that we must be in the key of D major. Note that there's no notes in the left hand that are occurring outside of that key, and the movement between the dominant and tonic just feels very natural. So even outside of the home key, things are very consonant. But I also want you to notice that there's a D7 here instead of a D, which naturally throws us back to the home key of G major. I also want you to notice that the left-hand pattern for each measure is virtually the same. And these numbers are just relative to the scale degrees of the major scale of each respective chord's root. What I want you to notice is that it draws mostly from the major pentatonic scale, which is the major scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. This scale tends to feel very happy and calming. And if you're curious about why that is, stick around for the bonus episode. The final thing that I want to mention here is that the only dissonance is in the dominant 7th chords, and they all resolve to their respective tonics. Next up is number 5 in D major. This piece feels jumpy and playful. It is slightly dissonant, but mostly otherwise it is consonant. Now let's talk about B major, one of my favorite major preludes. This piece feels light and playful, and this feeling is really emphasized by the gentle playing of the notes. It has very constant harmonization, and it ends on a relaxed feeling as well. So here's an example of a very consonant chord progression, especially from 3 minor to 4 to 1. And why does this work? Well, these minor chords, of course, feel kind of sad, but D sharp minor naturally flows up a half step into E major, and its 3 minor to 4 major movement is actually quite common. And furthermore, E goes to B fairly seamlessly. I've also pointed out one accidental. This is an E sharp, so it's a tritone with B, but it quickly moves to F sharp, and I think this just gives the piece a little bit more creative spice rather than dominating the entire phrase with dissonance. When I hear number 19 in E flat major, I think of a happy dog because it feels very fast and jumpy. It is consonant, but there are a few dissonant passages that contrast that. And finally, its ending is at once forceful and calm. So let's take a look at that main theme. Our chord progression is very palpable. We're going from E flat, the 1 chord, to major 2, to 5, to major 2, to 5, and that brings us back to 1 for another repetition of that chord progression. I want to point out that a major 2 chord is not diatonic, but it's also not an uncommon move, and it doesn't sound dissonant. In fact, the 2 major chord, which is F7 in this case, resolves very well to the 5 chord, which is B flat in this case. Let's take a look at that melody. For me, the melody is composed of the first note of each couplet because the second 2 notes are much quieter. When we look at this melody, we notice that there's lots of consonant intervals, thirds and fourths, and it is also drawing from the major pentatonic scale for the most part. I really love this passage because the deception here is extremely clever. First, we start out with B flat, which is the dominant of our home key, E flat. So we think we're going to go back to E flat, but instead we get a D flat 7, and that launches us into the key of G flat major. But even though we're in a distant key, the melody is still very consonant, has lots of major thirds and major seconds, but it does get dissonant at a point. And at this point, we have a G flat 7 that doesn't resolve to its respective tonic. And there's also a moment of F diminished here. And I think that this moment of dissonance really helps to bring out the consonants in the rest of the piece. It's like putting a little bit of salt in your cookies to make the sugar stand out more. So finally, we've reached, last but not least, number 26 in A flat major. This piece feels very light and jumpy. The notes move very fast, but still very consonantly. And notably, it starts to get quieter, starts to slow down until concluding very calmly. So there you have it, Chopin's major fast preludes. They feel light, jumpy, and playful. They feature fast playing, that is consonant as opposed to frantic. They tend to end slowly, quietly, and/or calmly. And finally, there is dissonance, but it's used more as a garnish or an accent to create points of interest rather than having a prevailing, dominating sound over the entire piece. And just like the minor fast preludes, I want you to pay attention to how these elements that I've explained here don't have anything to do with the choice of major as the scale. We haven't even touched the slow preludes, but I've gone over so much information that I think it's best we stop here for now. So I hope to see you in part 2 of this episode.